Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming today. My name is Joe Trova, and I'm a member of the Mining Department Seminar Committee. Our committee organizes the seminar series and invites speakers to come and address students, faculty, and interested industry professionals on a variety of mining-related topics. Since we are on Zoom today, I would like to request that everyone keep their microphones muted during the presentation and only unmute them during the question and answer session at the end. Also, just as a reminder, the seminar is being recorded and you'll be able to view it on the department's YouTube channel after the seminar has concluded and it's been uploaded. Today, I would like to welcome Dr. Erin Malone. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. Erin Malone is a postdoctoral research associate in the Center for Mining Sustainability and Mining Engineering Department at Colorado School of Mines. He completed his PhD in geography at the University of Colorado Boulder. He applies a social science lens to analyze mining's contributions and impacts across livelihoods, development, and sustainability in Latin America. Dr. Malone will be talking to us today about his work with artisanal mining in Peru. Welcome, Erin, and begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Joe, for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds great.
Okay, cool. I'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, thanks, Joe, for the introduction. Thanks, Fatih, for organizing the logistics behind the scenes. And thanks, everyone, for being present today. I have to apologize for being here on Zoom instead of there in person. I was hoping to be on campus today, but some complications on the home front have kept me from being there. So I have to apologize in advance, but I'm certainly happy to have conversations today and to continue conversations either in person or via email as well. My email is on the last slide of the presentation. So I'll just go ahead and jump right in. As Joe mentioned, I'm a postdoc working on at the Center for Mining Sustainability, or better known around campus, I think, as the UNSA projects, based in Peru. I'm working with Nicole Smith and a whole team of other people on that work. And what I'm presenting today is based on a paper that we published this year in GeoForum. And I am more than happy to share the full text, the PDF, with anyone who's interested. So just to jump right in, this research really focuses on artisanal mining, and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that here before I get too far. But just to start off with the research questions, we're really looking at this idea of dynamics of coexistence and conflict between artisanal mining and other rural livelihoods, which is to say, how does a boom in artisanal mining impact other ways of making a living in these rural communities where we were doing our work, which in this case mostly means farming and fishing. And then in terms of the paper, I'll talk a little bit about this today during the talk, and even more so it's in the paper, really trying to compare the realities of conflict or non-conflict coexistence in artisanal mining against what's seen in the literature on large-scale mining. There's obviously a huge literature around conflict and conflict avoidance and conflict management but it's mostly focused on the large-scale mining sector. And so that's a niche we're trying to fill with this paper, is taking that angle of coexistence or conflict between mining and other livelihoods and applying it to informal artisanal mining. I will note that in this paper, we don't talk about the dynamics between informal artisanal miners and mining companies, which often find themselves in close contact. And so that's a whole nother literature, and actually one that I'm just starting to dig into. And I know some people around the department have already been working on that. So that is an area of interest, but it's not what I'm gonna talk about today. So again, just to give a little framing, obviously with the boom in the extractive industry since the early 2000s, there's been a corresponding boom in conflicts in a lot of parts of the world, especially in the global south. As the resource frontier for extractive industries has been expanding, it brings new communities into contact with mining, right? And so there's always that possibility for friction or tension. And as I stated, the literature mostly focuses on conflicts between mining companies or large scale mining. And there's not as much understanding or as much research about how the boom in mining, which has happened across sectors, including artisanal mining, has influenced this dynamic between mining and other rural livelihoods when we're talking about artisanal mining. So obviously this whole question has really strong tie-ins with topics like social license, like corporate social responsibility, but again is somewhat different because of this focus on artisanal mining. So this is just to give a really slight primer. Peru is the 7th or 8th leading gold producer in the world, but the leading gold producer in Latin America. And most estimates say around 20% or up to 20% of Peru's gold production is from artisanal mining, right? So this is a really important sector within Peruvian mining and within kind of global gold supply chains. And even beyond that 20% production statistic, estimates, and these are pre-COVID estimates. I think a lot of people imagine that more people have turned to artisanal mining during COVID, during the pandemic, out of kind of because of slowdown in other economic sectors. And so perhaps around 500,000 people just in Peru who are working in the artisanal mining sector. And in some of the slides, you'll see ASM as just an abbreviation for artisanal mining. So again, so why study artisanal mining? Why are we even talking about this? If you want to think about rural development, if you think about these kind of remote areas in the global South, artisanal mining in particular has a really large employment impact. And especially in areas where other jobs are scarce or where the only other alternative is agriculture, which often has really low income potential. So there is this really strong rural development potential within artisanal mining, but it's also linked to these persistent environmental problems, poor working conditions, links to the black market, in some cases links to problems including human trafficking or child labor or prostitution, right? So there's all these kind of problems linked with artisanal mining, but I think it's important to underscore as well just how big of an employment impact and how much of a development potential it has in a lot of rural areas if some of the downsides can be dealt with in a way that can preserve some of the potential. And again, this dynamic is very different from traditional large-scale mining, which is highly capital intensive and increasingly low labor intensivity. Artisanal mining is basically the reverse. It has a very low capital intensivity, but it has a really large, it's highly labor intensive, right? So it's a very different profile on the ground. Okay, so I'm going to start talking a little bit about the location and kind of to give some framing of just what exactly it is that I'm talking about when I talk about artisanal mining. So the study site for this project is Alto Molino and Iquipi, which are two communities in the Rio Grande district near Arequipa, Peru. I don't have a view of who all's in the room, but I know that other people in the department have been doing projects there. There was a project on ventilation and a project on mine safety and rock collapse, rockfall, that we're working in the same community. So some people will be familiar with these study sites. On this map, it shows the location. All of the little red dots are artisanal miners or artisanal mining operations that have been registered with the Peruvian government. And so they're in the process of becoming formalized. Just to give you an idea of the density of artisanal mining activity in this area, you see a little below, kind of in the lower left, you see Secocha, which is an even larger concentration of artisanal mining activity. And then Alto Molino and Iquipi, kind of in the center of the map, are my key study sites, which really grew in artisanal mining activity just in the last 5 years with some spillover from as Secocha started to become saturated more or less. To understand a little bit, I'll show some pictures throughout the slideshow that really help give an idea of this setting, but this is a really arid setting with extremely steep valley slopes. And so all agricultural activity is limited just to the floodplain. There's really not even grazing, like not even raising livestock or anything beyond the floodplain itself. So that's to give a little bit of that context. So you can see this really tight agricultural corridor along the Oconee River Valley. This is a relatively remote location. It's about 70 kilometers from the coast where the Pan American Highway crosses or passes by, but it's just a dirt road that connects, and the whole valley, according to official statistics, only has around 15,000 residents, right? So this is a very remote and rural area. But what's happened in recent years has been this dramatic boom in artisanal mining activity. So this is the main plaza, the main town square in Alto Molino. You can see off in the background in the slopes, you can see where these small scale and artisanal mining operations are taking place. And you see that, you know, for a rural area, there's quite a bit of movement and activity, right? There's a lot of traffic coming and going. There's a lot of new construction. You can see in this picture, these are two Google Earth images, satellite images, one from 2004, one from 2019. The extent is the same. And you can see just a dramatic, I mean, you know, in 2004, basically all you have is the town plaza there where the bullseye is, and one other street or two other streets of residential sites. And by 2019, you see this whole expanse of urban growth. And you see over on the far right where I have the crossed hammers, what's called locally an industrial park, which is where mercury amalgamation is done to process the locally produced ore, right? So you see this dramatic growth of the town site itself and of the population that goes along with that. And so that's kind of the context that we're looking at, is in this kind of boomtown setting where you see this really rapid, dramatic growth. How does mining get along with other traditional livelihoods and with the kind of pre-existing population in the area? I'm going to step back a couple slides to one I skipped over. So in terms of the actual production in this area, all of the mining is conducted as hard rock tunnel mining. So you see here on the mining pad outside of the tunnel opening, dumping waste rock in this picture, in the first picture. The second picture, the first stage of processing that's done locally is a rudimentary amalgamation technique using mercury. So these are like kind of a giant mortar and pestle. The guy in the Packers jersey like walks to rock the stone back and forth and mix the ore with water and mercury for amalgamation. The tailings from that process are later sold to processing plants on the coast. And I'm going to talk about that because that's an important point in understanding these dynamics in the site. And then finally, we have local gold buyers who often are also the suppliers of mercury, but they'll basically buy the mercury gold amalgamation on site, burn off or evaporate the mercury, and purchase the gold there on site to then be, you know, moved out into the market from there. So that's kind of the basic step by step. I know it's quite simple, quite a simplistic explanation, but that's just to give you at least the basics of what's happening here in this site. Okay. And as I've mentioned, our goal is to understand how this boom in artisanal mining that's really happened in the last 5 years, this dramatic, probably quadrupling of this town in about 5 years' time, how that's impacted this dynamic between artisanal mining and other livelihoods. And so what we see in this area is kind of a three-part traditional livelihood mix. The leading livelihood is agriculture. There's both kind of subsistence level production as well as more commercial production of some crops like onions and grapes for wine, and some other things like that. And then there's also a strong fishing, which is also a more or less artisanal fishing of people catching these river shrimp, either using manual collection by hand or using simple traps that are placed in the river. And then you also have mining activity, which has grown dramatically in the last 5 years, but that also pre-existed as a kind of part of that traditional livelihood mix going back generations, even centuries in this valley, right? So you have this traditional livelihood mix where these three livelihoods have always kind of coexisted, both within the community and even within individual people or individual households, which which are engaged in all three livelihoods. And so I think that that was a key starting point for us, was to understand this tradition of coexistence, this historic livelihood mix that really set the table for some kind of baseline acceptance of mining as something that's positive and that's always been part of the culture and the tradition in this spot. But again, with this growth, what we've seen is that mining in this community has moved from being an activity on the margin and kind of the third part in this triangle to being really moved very rapidly into the center, right? So moving from the margins to the center in just the course of a few years. So again, just to restate the research questions before I get into what are the dynamics of coexistence and conflict between artisanal mining and other rural livelihoods, and how does our ASM case study compare to the established literature on conflict and large-scale mining? Okay, and I'm going to go into a little more depth just because I have a little more time today than usual, and because I imagine that probably a lot of maybe a lot of people listening today don't necessarily do a lot of qualitative research. So I'm going to take a little more time, just 2 or 3 minutes, to talk about the research methods in just a little more depth. So this research is based on qualitative fieldwork. Our team did 4 visits to the site between July 2019 and February 2020. And most of what we did was interviews. We did a few community meetings and some other things like that, but the majority of our data collection was through individual interviews, one-on-one or in small groups. And we structured our data collection around this concept of saturation, or basically the idea that we're going to keep doing interviews and keep building out our networks until we start to no longer hear new information, and we feel like we've saturated the information that we're bringing in, and that's when we know that we've done enough to be able to represent these different perspectives and viewpoints that we're trying to document and analyze, and that's when we're able to kind of move along to the analysis stage. I do want to emphasize that our key focus was to understand all the different key actors in the area, and so we weren't primarily talking with miners. We were talking with local leaders, farmers, fishers, miners, and community members at large, right? So talking with miners was like one part of these 5 key groups that we were trying to talk to. And then from there, we moved on to a step called coding. So working in this program called In Vivo, we basically took all of our field notes and all of our transcripts from interviews, and we input them in this program, and it allows us to go through and identify different key topics or codes, and to kind of highlight and flag different sections within each document and link them to different codes. And then we can go back and go into the code and to see how all the different parts from different interviews fit together, right? So that's kind of the analysis method there. This is what that looks like. You can, you're reading a transcript, and you see here on the side the coding stripes. You can code different parts of the interview to different topics, and then you can link across different interviews that all deal with the same thing. So that's kind of some of the methodology behind the scenes, just to give a little glimpse. Moving into the results. In the paper, we focused on 6 factors or 6 areas that really influence these dynamics of coexistence and conflict. I'm just going to talk about 3 of them in the talk today, but these are the 6 that we talk about in the paper. So the first is water, the second is land, the third is economic trade-offs. We talk about immigration, and again, within this context of lots of people arriving for this mining activity in what was a very small community beforehand. We talk about social dynamics and power, so relations between people within the community and different groups. And then we talk about history and previous conflict. So I'll just mention this one, even though it's not really part of the talk. Some members of the community had mobilized to resist a hydroelectric dam project. And so that kind of created what we imagined, if people have already mobilized once to resist a hydroelectric dam project or protest against it, they have all all that experience and that groundwork, and they understand, the power of protesting. And so we were a little surprised with that historical precedent of protesting against and stopping this hydroelectric project, that hadn't bled over or that didn't lead into conflict around mining, which I think really just underscores that potential for coexistence, right? And the fact that even with this history of previous conflicts, that in this community we didn't see any sort of outward conflict against this artisanal mining boom. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the first 3 points: water, land, and economic trade-offs in a little more detail each, and then I'll move on to the conclusions. So our first results section, again, and I guess I should mention, these 6 factors are things that we drew. So we framed our analysis of coexistence or conflict around key trends that we had seen in the literature on conflicts around large-scale mining, right? So that's where these ideas come from. And what we identified in the literature is that in terms of conflicts around mining projects, that water seems to be the number one factor driving conflicts, followed a close second by competition for land or kind of spatial overlap, right? So water stands out as this really key factor. And in the literature, a lot of times the conflicts that emerge around mining projects and water focus on both quantity and qualities, which is to say access to water, availability of water, as well as concerns around water quality or water contamination. And we saw that as a really key point of distinction in this case of artisanal mining compared to the kind of typical case study profile that we've seen in the literature around large-scale mining. And what we really identified as a key point here is that there doesn't appear to be any sort of competition for water availability, or there's not a sense of water scarcity in this community. Despite being a highly arid landscape, the Aconia River Valley is a huge watershed that's fed by a very large kind of upper watershed in the Andes. And all of the local farming depends on that, on irrigation from that river water rather than other sources. And so there was this sense of abundance around water that stood in stark contrast to a lot of the literature where access to water or quantity of water is a key point. And so I think that was kind of an important starting point for us to understand. But from there, we did identify that if conflicts are likely to emerge in the future within this context, that water is likely to be a key point of contention, but rather about quality rather than quantity, right? So not about access to water, but rather about water quality concerns. So here I put up 2 quotes on the board. These are both from the same meeting with the leaders of the Fishing Association. One of them basically saying, you know, we don't have a problem with the artisanal mining boom. As long as miners are working responsibly, we can all live together. And the other saying, the informal miners say they don't contaminate, but that's false. Just by being here, they're contaminating, right? So one person within the association taking a very hard line, and the other saying, you know, we can coexist, we can get along. And what we found in general was that there was widespread concern within the community. Almost everyone we talked to in the community expressed concern about whether mining was driving a decline in the river shrimp population. As I noted at the beginning, between farming and river shrimp fishing, that was the key incomes besides mining in this area. And a lot of families depend on river shrimp fishing as a source of quick cash compared to agricultural cycles where you invest when you plant and you don't get any sort of payoff until 4 months later when you harvest, right? And so fishing represents this kind of quick cash livelihood that's important to complement the slow cycles of agriculture. And so there was a lot of concern within the community about whether the shrimp fishery was being harmed by local mining activity. But what we found at the end of the day, on my title for this section, I talk about water contamination and uncertainty. And I think that uncertainty came out as this key factor that really shaped all of the conversations we had around water quality and water contamination. And what we found was just that understanding what was going on in the water, what contaminants were there, whether contamination was or wasn't linked to the shrimp fishery, even the question of whether the shrimp fishery actually was or wasn't declining. All these questions were somewhat undefined, and there was a lack of hard data, and there was a lack of reliable studies. And so people had hunches and people had ideas, but even community members would say, you know, like, I'm worried that the shrimp fishery is declining, but we just don't know. We don't have the information. The government doesn't do enough studies. The university hasn't done enough studies. And what we found was that all of this uncertainty really created a kind of inertia where people basically weren't willing to act or weren't willing to mobilize as they had done it against the hydroelectric dam. They were much more kind of stuck in this cycle of feeling like they weren't certain. There wasn't enough information, that the anecdotal evidence that was available was not strong enough to support taking action. And so people were definitely worried about water quality and water contamination, but again, it didn't rise to the level of an outright conflict. And so I think, again, in this broader scope of comparing artisanal mining dynamics and large-scale mining dynamics, you know, we saw that there is this fundamental possibility for coexistence, at least in this case study, in this type of setting, right? There wasn't this zero-sum competition for availability of water, right? So there was that possibility within the perception of the community that these different livelihood activities could all coexist in terms of availability of water, as long as environmental problems were dealt with and didn't grow worse. The second point that we focused on was access to land. Again, this point was motivated by the literature on conflicts in the large-scale mining sector, where often access to land is a key point of contention, second only to water. And again, this point was notable by its absence. In these communities where we were working, there really was not any sense of competition for actual land between agriculture and mining. And so again, this is a little bit context specific, but I think it's a key point to understand that in this setting, the agricultural activity, as I mentioned before, is limited only to the floodplains. You can see the slopes are absolutely barren with not even plants for grazing. And that's exactly where the mining activity is taking place. And so you see these two activities that are physically separated in terms of the land that they're using. And then there's also a key point around the technologies of production and processing. So again, these are hard rock mines, but they follow very small veins, and they move relatively small amounts of material compared to a lot of other forms of mining. What's considered waste rock is dumped immediately on site, and a lot of that comes down into the river, which does become a point of contention. But these facilities don't produce any substantial on-site tailings to be stored and managed. And again, that's in part a reflection of their processing. So the ore is processed on site through a simple mercury amalgamation process. But because the miners and the processing center owners recognize that amalgamation process only gets out, let's say, around 40% of the gold, those tailings are then sold on to processing plants in a city called Chala on the coast. And so all of that tailings, rather than being stored on site and having ponds or dams or piles, all of those tailings are bagged, loaded onto trucks, and shipped to the coast to be reprocessed in cyanidation plants that extract that 60% or 50 to 60% of the gold content that was left behind after amalgamation. And so what you see is that technical limitation of the artisanal miners not having the capacity to build their own cyanide plants on site means that they're shipping these tailings away, and it removes a potent source of conflict, which is to say all of the literal space needed for tailings containment in a lot of settings is moved somewhere else. And so that, again, is another factor where, because the mines and the farming are in different sites, and because the miners are not storing tailings on site, there's really no sense of competition for land. And so you see this big difference between that sense of a zero-sum competition for land in a lot of cases, and what we see here where that just doesn't exist And again, that creates the potential for coexistence over a longer term. I will highlight that these kind of the material characteristics of mining on this site are not uniform in artisanal mining. You can look at the examples in the Peruvian Amazon, where alluvial mining does conflict directly with other livelihoods and indigenous groups for land and creates large-scale deforestation. So again, thinking about how mining practices and how land use practices do or don't create the scene for conflict is somewhat specific to different contexts. Okay, the final point here is around economic trade-offs. I think as with any development project, mining or otherwise, there's always a kind of a calculus being done by officials, by local people, by the companies of what are the economic trade-offs, what are the benefits, what are the costs, and especially in the case of projects like this or of reality like an artisanal mining boom, weighing this potential for new employment and new income opportunities against perceived threats to existing livelihoods, right? So we have on the one hand the perceived threat to the shrimp fishery, and we have on the other hand the perception of more economic activity, both through direct jobs in artisanal mining and through kind of spin-off and spillover effects in all kinds of other economic activities that are more active because of this boom in mining. When we talk about conflict and economic trade-offs for large-scale mining projects, usually what we're talking about are negotiations between companies and governments and communities around things like employment quotas or community benefit projects, in some cases even community profit sharing, right? Different things like that. And because of the informal nature of artisanal mining, it's a different nature of trade-offs and calculations, and you don't have that strong role for government to play as an intermediary. You have a much more kind of informal and ad hoc relationship and kind of takeaway or calculations that people are doing. So I have, again, two quotes. One, the first one from this council member saying, before the miners came, our population, very few sent their kids to the city to study. Now almost all are sending their kids to university, right? There were a lot of quotes very similar to this one, basically saying that with the boom in mining, they had seen this huge explosion in economic activity, and there had been all these spillover benefits in other sectors, and that the whole area had benefited from the growth seen being driven by the artisanal mining boom. The second quote is from a farmer who lived a little farther up valley, but within 10 minutes walk from the mines, and he took a very different view. He said, mining doesn't help us in any way. They're carrying away the riches of our town, and they don't even fix up the road. And so, again, there was this perception that the risks were generalized and the benefits were individualized, right? And so, again, similar to some of the debates seen in any type of development project, there's the question of uneven distribution of benefits, of who has the profits and where they keep them or take them. There was an issue for farmers of wage inflation. A lot of farmers mentioned to us that they depended on hiring day laborers during the harvest and planting seasons, and that the wages for those workers had gone up by around 50%, right? And so you have this kind of competition and wage inflation. But in general, I would say that most people that we talked to, the general perception within the community was that mining had been a positive economic influence in their community, though it did bring with it some trade-offs or some potential downsides. All right, so that's three different facets of trying to understand this dynamic of what is the community and what do other livelihoods, how is their relationship with an artisanal mining boom. So I'll just wrap up with some conclusions. You'll have to forgive me. I don't know the norms in every field, but I'm going to read a couple paragraphs here just to make sure that I kind of am concise with this conclusion. So the dynamics that we observed in the study community in Alto Molino demonstrated that artisanal mining and other rural livelihoods like fishing and agriculture didn't have to be directly in conflict, but neither did they always coexist without tension. if we compare this case to the larger literature around mining and conflict in large-scale settings, it reinforces the insight that debates and decisions around extraction do provoke internal conflicts within a community around differing visions for the place and tensions over who has the power to decide and influence local futures. We found a baseline acceptance of artisanal mining in this case study, and the idea of baseline acceptance that it could coexist with other livelihoods. But that did seem likely to dissipate if environmental harm worsened or if impacts on other livelihoods became more certain, right? So what was clear to us was that residents were not willing to sacrifice other livelihoods for artisanal mining, but that they were happy to have artisanal mining in their community as long as they felt that farming and fishing could also continue to prosper. So in sum, we found a basic perception that artisanal mining could coexist with other livelihoods, but uncertainty about whether or not this would play out in practice over the long run. And even here, I think even the possibility, even though it's uncertain, the very possibility of this long-term coexistence does seem to stand in contrast to a lot of the conflict case studies in the literature, where community conflicts for mining companies are increasingly problematic, even with greater emphasis on social license and corporate social responsibility. That conflicts have still seemed to multiply even with these greater emphasis on trying to avoid them. I think that these conclusions have implications for policymaking and management of the artisanal mining sector. There's been a lot of focus on formalization as the main policy objective and the main direction, especially I think both in Peru and kind of globally around artisanal mining. But I think our research, I think one of the takeaways is that if people really want to, if officials really want to try to maximize the development potential, and especially in struggling rural areas, the development potential of artisanal mining is strong, right? If officials want to try to maintain that development potential, but also deal with some of the problems that go along with artisanal mining, then taking this coexistence mindset and approach could really be a way to manage that, right? So focusing on fostering coexistence between livelihoods could help secure the viability and acceptance of the sector. And it also explicitly integrates local concerns, and it makes artisanal miners accountable to local stakeholders and creates new avenues for transparency in the operations as well, which again can help provide a pathway to dealing with environmental problems, working conditions, connections to black market and other problems without throwing away the kind of employment and development potential that does exist in this sector. So I'll leave it at that. I put up here on this final slide a screenshot of the first page of the paper. And again, as I said, I'm more than happy to share PDFs with anyone who would like one.
Aaron, thank you so much for your presentation. Your work with ASM is fascinating, and the ability for mining of all scales to coexist with society is an essential topic. We have a few minutes for questions if you have the time.
Yep.
I'll begin there's several questions in the chat already, so I'll just start at the top. Question from Carlos Aramillo. Regarding land competition, is there any alluvial mining in the river? Could that become a point of conflict in the future?
Yeah, so thanks, Carlos, for the question. In this particular site, that's a pretty easy answer. No, there has not been any alluvial activity in the river. I don't know enough about the details to say with certainty that it wouldn't happen in the future, but I don't have the sense that that is. I don't have the sense that that's likely in this setting. And so again, that difference in terms of hard rock and tunnel mining in this context versus like what's seen in Madre de Dios, where you have alluvial mining and massive deforestation, it's a completely different kind of environmental context.
Thank you. A question from Aaron Trova. Who acted as the interviewer for these interviews? And do you think there were any interviewer effects on the answers. I just want to say language is also probably part of the communication going on with interviews here as well, right?
Sorry, can you say that last part again?
Yes, there's obviously language translation kind of things going on as well.
Yes. Yeah, so that's a great question. I was the interviewer in the majority of the cases. I did work with colleagues from UNSA, and so a lot of times we did the interviews as a team. So typically there would have been at least 2 people doing the interview. I speak Spanish, so we just did the interviews outright. We didn't have like a translator as such. But yeah, there's always an interviewer effect. I think that's part of the challenge. You know, our qualitative research is definitely a mix of art and science. It's not a pure science, and there's a lot of kind of art to it. And I think one of the arts involved is, as a researcher, as an interviewer, being able to kind of sense whether people are just telling you what you want to hear or whether they're really answering honestly and frankly. And I think that was something that you know, we felt pretty comfortable by the end with the results that we were getting, again, with this concept of saturation and trying to keep going until we felt like we really knew what was going on, and had a grasp of the situation. We're hearing, you know, things repeated rather than new things in a lot of cases. So again, I mean, yes, I think it's likely that there are interviewer effects. I think just by the very fact of asking questions around conflict, right? You're putting conflict on the table as a topic of interest. And so I think that's going to influence to some extent what people are answering. But I do feel pretty comfortable in the end with the results that we got in this survey, or not survey, and the results of these interviews and the conclusions of the study. And I'll just mention too, I mean, working with local colleagues from the University in Arequipa was fundamental in being able to, not necessarily needing them as translators, but having that cultural interpretation and having the connections to be able to show up in the community and know who to contact and have some contacts to start from. So I think, you know, even though I was the main interviewer for this project, having Eliseo there, having some students that went with us one time, having a local person from the community who we hired for a few days when I was there by myself, all of those things really helped kind of ease that barrier as well and help us secure access for good interviews.
Thank you, Aaron. The next question, let's see. I'm going to go through the chat first, but we do have even more questions. That's all right.
Yeah.
Question from Elizabeth Holly. Thanks, Aaron. So neat to see this come together. What can we learn here that can be applied to avoid conflicts between communities and large-scale mining projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think if I were gonna say kind of one takeaway of what this can tell us about relationships with larger scale projects, is this idea of kind of any way that you can avoid the emergence of a zero-sum mindset, any way that you can avoid the perception in the community that development of the mine will cancel out things like agriculture or fishing or whatever the existing local livelihoods are, right? I think that, you know, it's going to depend on the details of each mine and each context and each community, right? There's a lot of moving parts, but I think maybe the takeaway, if you can apply from this towards bigger projects, is that idea of like, once a zero-sum perception exists, it's going to be very difficult. But as long as what we found in this community was, right, it wasn't that people didn't have any concerns. People did have concerns, but they felt like on a baseline level that there was at least the possibility of coexistence. And I think that was key for why outright conflicts never did emerge in that site.
The next question was, do artisanal miners pay taxes?
That is a great question. I mean, I think yes and no. I think you can basically say no with probably some caveats. You know, definitely when we talked to the local mayor, one of the things he said we talked to the local mayor probably at least once every time we were on site. And every time he would say, because these miners are artisanal, they don't pay the taxes, and so we don't get the royalty feedback that's called the canon, the mining canon, right? Which is like a system for mining income to the federal government to be kicked back out to regional and local governments. And so, they don't get that calculation, they don't get that funding. And so the local government doesn't have the same kind of spending power that a local government would have if this had been a corporate mining project. And so that was something that definitely was on the mind of the local officials at the least. Do artisanal miners pay taxes? I mean, I'm sure that they don't get out of all their taxes, but I think it's going to depend a lot on a case-by-case basis. And it's definitely not the same kind of massive tax prop that you see in a lot of bigger mining projects.
To give our in-person audience a chance to ask questions, I'm going to switch to that.
Yeah, my question was about his methodology with in vivo, and if he did like a word-by-word transcription of all the hours of recording and then a translation, or if he did like a summary and then coded that.
Yeah, great question. So I didn't mention this initially, but we did 30 interviews, and if I had to say offhand, I think 10, let's say a dozen, around 10 or 12 of them were audio recorded, and the other 20 or so we just did detailed notes in a notebook as we were doing the interview. And we did that in part because, again, anytime you're asking about contentious issues like conflict or there was a perception, I think, in a lot of, especially when we were talking to farmers, they felt like the artisanal miners had become kind of the heavy hitters in their community, the people who could really throw some weight around, and that they didn't want to get on the wrong side. And so we were a little reluctant to ask people to audio record in some settings. So long story short, we did audio record and transcribe some of the interviews. I didn't bother to translate those all because I can read in Spanish. And so I did my analysis of those transcriptions in Spanish, and then particular quotes that I wanted to include in the paper, I would just translate just as quotes, and that saved a lot of time. And then for everything else, for the other interviews that weren't audio recorded word for word, I would have my detailed notes that myself and whoever else was doing the interview were kind of taking as we went, and we would make a point each night. We did 3 interviews or 5 interviews or whatever it was during the day. Like each night before I went to bed, those had to be taken out of my notebook and typed up into these detailed notes that might have been 10 pages a day of detailed notes, to really not lose that detail and not let the interviews and the days start to bleed together, and to try to preserve that quality and detail, knowing that we had the limitation of not tape recording everything.
We have a couple more questions from the audience. Lee, do you want to go next?
Hi, Aaron. This is Lisa Mayoa. From this code thing, we have basically the 3 main types artisanal mining for this reduced area. We have legal small scale mining represented by the Century mine, that one. We have the under formalization process miners, who are everything below, within this area of influence of Alto Molino town. And we have the open legal illegal miners, who are in the Secocha. Secocha town is even an illegal city, right? My question is there any difference in the dynamics for each of these actors with respect to the development of this area, or they are basically the same in all cases?
That's a great question. There was a very clear line drawn in our interviews. There were a lot of people, we never asked, one of the questions that we would ask in the interviews was, would you rather have informal artisanal miners or a corporate mining project in your town? That was one of the questions we asked. And we got varying responses depending on who we were talking to and their perception. That one was, it wasn't a clear cut one way or the other. But I will say, we never asked, here in Alto Molino, how do you compare to Secocha? But people would always bring it up on their own as a point of reference. And what people always said was, we don't want to become another Secocha. I don't know if I don't think that they were referring to the legal status of mining in Secocha. I think they were more referring to just how big and how dominant how impactful it was in terms of kind of community dynamics and some of the social problems being more exaggerated, and I think perceived pollution problems being more exaggerated. So I think yes, people did draw distinctions, and I think I would draw distinctions analyzing the development impacts between, if we say Secocha, Alto Molino, and San Juan de Churunga. But I think that those impacts had, I think that the level of formality or legality or illegality was only kind of one factor amongst a lot of others that kind of drove those impacts. I think on that level too, people were pretty clear again in saying that they also would compare themselves favorably to San Juan de Churunga. They felt that the company, played a lot of games in different ways to try to avoid kind of paying their fair share and carrying their weight, was the perception of community members. And so the company, used a lot of tricks and accounting games and different things like that to not contribute as much through taxes to the community as people felt they should. So I think artisanal miners, they don't pay taxes on some level, but then, there's maybe more circulation within the community, and they would make a point of having, contributing to really visible efforts like, donating for the Agricultural Association to fix their canals and things like that. So I think people had a more favorable perception of the artisanal miners in Alto Molino compared to the company in Century or the illegal miners in Secocha. But I guess in terms of like a hard analysis of development impact, I think would be hard to necessarily nail down.
Thank you, Aaron. We are nearing the end of our allotted time, so some people may have to head out. If you're okay answering a couple more questions, though.
Yeah, of course.
All right, go ahead.
Well, Aaron, thank you for
Could you take your mask off just to ask the question?
Aaron, thank you for this great presentation. So I just wonder, what's the history of mining there? Because that matters for the long-term impact of environmental aspects, especially those slopes and feeding to the rivers with solids would have some implications in the future, especially the fishing and farming. Did you ask these kind of questions, or is this already something that has been felt? Or I just want to know more about this interrelation.
Could you hear okay?
Yeah, I think so. I maybe didn't catch every word, but I think I got the gist of it. And so, yeah, the history of mining in the area and is super important to understand, and is somewhat complex in addition, because just upstream in San Juan de Churunga, you have a small scale corporate mine that's been owned at different times by a German individual, and then a Peruvian company, and then a Canadian company, and then now a Peruvian company. But that operation has been in continual operation for, I want to say, 60 years or more. And I think that there were definitely some tailings management issues at that mine in the past that really made a big impact. People told us a lot of stories about fish kills, where waste that had been left in a ravine was washed away during high water and caused fish kills in the main river. And so people were really aware of those kind of things, and that there was this legacy within the local perceptions. There was a local perception of what the negative legacies of mining could be. And again, that hadn't necessarily been the local artisanal miners on site hadn't been caught up or tied in with that necessarily. And so that growth had been much more recent. There had been, very small scale artisanal mining in the area for a really long time, but in terms of substantial operations like what you're seeing today, they were pretty new. And so you did have this kind of long-term presence of mining in the valley, for sure, that goes way back. But also these really dramatic changes just within the most recent years yeah, like you said, there's a lot of questions about things like management, solids into the river, things like that, that certainly jumped out as potential points of conflict, and that people seemed to be concerned about and trying to monitor, but also feeling limited in how well they really could monitor the situation, or how deep of an understanding they really could get to.
Thank you. One more question from the room, and then 2 more in the chat, and then that'll be it.
Hey there, so I'm just curious what the community, what the community's religious leaders' views are on the artisanal mining boom, how active they are within this conflict, and how influential the religious leaders are as a stakeholder within this community.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have to admit that I don't know if that's one point that I don't know if we really did or didn't get to the bottom. What I can tell you is that this is a really small town. And like I said, it's pretty isolated. Like it's up a dirt road that takes a couple hours to get up from the highway, and the highway itself is, it's not exactly near a big city. In all the time that I spent there, I never saw the doors of the church open. And people told me that they would only have a priest come visit occasionally. And I don't know what occasionally means, but to be honest, I think, yes, the church is an important player. The Catholic Church is an important player, but it didn't seem to have that really central protagonistic role that has been documented in some other cases in Peru and in Latin America. And I didn't see any presence of I could be wrong, and Lee might know better. I didn't see any presence of evangelistic churches there either. So I think it would just be the Catholic Church as a player. But again, maybe somewhat surprisingly, it didn't seem to be a big player in this area.
I'm going to go to my advisor's question next instead of my sister's. So if you were to do the same study on the development of the Stillwater mine along the East Boulder River in Montana, do you think you'd find a different conclusion? It appears to me that peaceful coexistence in mining has always been predicated on effective communication. Thanks, Corby.
That's a great question. I have to plead ignorance a little bit. I don't know the details of the Stillwater mine in Montana. I do think that the point around communication is very strong and certainly important. Although I think in terms of communication, I think that in this particular site that we were studying in Alto Molino, there were a few key key figures who were local. They were people from local families, and they had become kind of figureheads of the artisanal mining operations. Whether they were really the true stakeholders who were really pocketing a lot of the profits or not, I don't know all the details of that, because obviously that's gets into some difficult data to obtain and verify. But I do think that having some figureheads that the person that people saw as the manager of 2 or 3 of the key biggest artisanal operations or small scale operations in this site were from local families. They were people who had a profile in the community, and I think that really facilitated both communication and also kind of generated a sense of linkage, a sense that artisanal mining on some level belonged to and benefited the local community. Whereas if those figurehead people from local families from the community hadn't existed, and the kind of most visible actors for the artisanal mining boom had been all from the outside, then I think that both that level of communication and that kind of level of acceptance and self-identification with mining maybe wouldn't have existed. But I have to apologize. I really can't give a comparison with the Stillwater project in Montana.
The final question: what kind of stakeholder engagements occurred in order to facilitate the coexistence that is present at this site? This kind of relates to the answer you just gave, but.
Yeah, and again, just to reemphasize, these are all kind of informal or in process of formalization, as they call it, operations. And so, I mean, stakeholder engagement as such, no, these groups don't have a community relations team or person or any of that. But that said, I think there's a growing recognition that a lot of the things that companies do and call corporate social responsibility, like these artisanal miners are doing the same things, right? So both the artisanal miners and the farming association leader independently, without talking to each other, they both told me in interviews, oh, when they need to repair the irrigation canals, we're there with free machinery, free concrete, use of our technical staff, right? And the farmers told me the same thing. So they're doing those same kinds of things of like making visible contributions to the community. But I think it's all on a kind of very, just a very ad hoc basis and not really following any sort of like concrete plan that could be called stakeholder engagement.
With that, we are out of time. I had some questions of my own written down, but I think I'll just email them to you. Thank you so much for your talk. As we near the end of our time, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who's here and everyone who came. Thanks again, Aaron, for presenting. This mining seminar series takes place every Wednesday at 4 p.m. We strive to bring you a qualified, interesting speaker series from all facets of the mining industry. You can find more information about the speaker series on the department website, mining.mines.edu, and on the department LinkedIn page. You can also watch this and past seminars on our YouTube channel. Please follow us on LinkedIn for weekly updates on departmental activities, including the speaker series. Just want to thank everyone one more time, and thank you, Dr. Malone, as well, for a great talk. And with that, I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Joe. It was a pleasure.